Hey guys, this is Matthias from 5 Minutes of Poker, and today I'm going to talk about opening ranges and what cards you can open from the small blind in 6 max hold'em. This is not the same as opening in small blind when you're playing heads up, because when you're playing heads up you have position post flop. So this is only when you're playing in the small blind versus the big blind in a ring game. This is the range I'm opening against an unknown opponent. It's a pretty solid range. I'm making a mistake on the loser side usually, because the games I tend to play, the big blinds haven't started defending enough yet, so I can open a bit wider as a standard. But as we'll see later, regs open a little less than this. As I've discussed in an earlier videos, and this is the most crucial position. Now it's much less about the hands you're opening, because Jack 6 suited or 10-6 suited or King Jack off all have the same or very similar equity and playability against if your opponent defends 40% of his hands in the big blind. So it's gonna be all about how often your big blind calls and he 3-bets. One key figure to remember is that if your opponent folds more than 62.5% of his hands against a small blind open, you can raise any 2 cards. And why is this? Yeah, this is because if you raise 3x in the small blind, you risk 2.5 big blinds to win 1.5 big blind. So I get 2.5 divided by 4, which gives me the break-even frequency. This means that if he folds 62.5% of that time, I'm gonna win 1.5 big blind. And then if I just fold every other time, so that means in 37.5% of the hands, I'm just gonna fold post flop and lose my 2.5 big blinds. I'm gonna break even. And what this means is that if he folds more than 62.5% of the time, you can raise with your VIP club card or whatever. You don't even need a hand. And also what you can consider is that almost all hands, even 7 deuce off, have something like 25% equity. It might not be that easy to realize it post flop, but so even if someone folds only defends 50% of their hands, it's gonna be it can be quite profitable to open the small blind. The other thing you should look for is big blind's 3-betting range. If you 3-bets a lot, you're not gonna be able to realize your equity, and you're gonna lose a lot of money pre-flop because you can't defend or 4-bet against his strategy. When I've done calculations with PO Solver, which is a poker program that more or less solves poker, it suggests that the optimal 3-betting strategy is 20% in the big blind. So big blind should have an optimal 3-bet strategy of 20% against the small blind. This is due to the fact that rake is such a huge cost. So whenever you can take down the pot without paying rake, it's a huge win for you. So that's why you have such a high 3-bet frequency. There's not a lot of players who have that high frequency of 3-bet yet. I am convinced that in a few years all the good players will be playing 20% 3-bet range. as we're gonna converge to the theoretically optimal stats. But if your opponent 3-bets less than that, maybe has something like 12% and folds 50% of his hands to a raise, then you can open quite a large range. I mean, I still wouldn't open all hands, because that will make it easier for your opponent to adjust. So, I mean, if you just, let's say you open something like this, 70% of your hands, I mean, your opponent might be a bit suspicious if he sees you open king 4 off, but it might not be enough for him to adjust. But let's say you open ace 2 off and win a hand because you flop trip deuces or something like that. There's a couple of different scenarios. He can either realize that, wow, he's opening all of his hands. I must make him. I'm probably making some sort of mistake in the big blind, and adjust by 3-betting you more or calling more, making it less profitable. Or he might just be pissed and start calling with all his hands, which is probably if you're opening wide, makes it the perfect play for him. So I prefer to just keep it, even if I could open all hands profitable, I'd still just keep it to 70% to sort of fly under the radar, and not letting my opponent know that I fold some hands, and I'm not just opening every hand to take advantage of him. If we look at the regs in hand to note, we can see that their average is 37%, and it's really hard to make something from this diagram. So I just put together this block, which is somewhat representative of a 37% range. It's much more about hitting like good pairs here when you're playing out of position. I mean, you can debate which hands you should and should not open, but as I said, it's much more about the player type than the hands you're playing. If we look at Snowy, he prefers to have a limping strategy. I mean, to play perfect poker, you probably need a limping strategy, and against some opponents, a limping strategy might actually be more profitable than just having a racing strategy. But for me, it's much easier to just race. So and the EV gain is not that big with an additional limping strategy from a game theory optimal perspective. You could argue that against some opponents who doesn't raise a limp as much as you should have a limping. You can have an exploitive limping strategy and just take it down post flop with a half pot or 3/4 pot bet. That was the Snowy small blind range. If we look at another alias of winning regs, you can see here that the mean is 45%, but there seems to be the standard deviation is quite large, 12%. So it doesn't really seem that there's a strong. It seems that a lot of different strategies are viable, and also one of the reasons that this is so widespread is that some people are using a limping strategy. Some of the winning rigs are using a limping strategy, and that's why you're gonna see these low opening ranges down here. And then you have the players who maybe they play on a poker network where the evolution hasn't come that far. Because I mean, if you look at players on PokerStars, they are the best players in the world. If you go to 888, they're gonna be less competent, and if you go further down to microgaming or Winamax or even smaller networks, the players there are gonna be less developed, so they're gonna overfold and under 3-bet in the big blind, which will allow some regs to open, you see here, like 60, 70, 80% of their hands profitable. So this spread is probably due to the factor that these rigs come from different networks, and the metagame allows them to open a much wider range there. But as I said, there are still players on PokerStars where you can open a very wide range and make a good profit. So it's much more about your opponent than your opening range when you're in the small blind playing against the big blind. If you have any questions or suggestions or topics, let me know. Write a comment. Let me know what you think. And good luck at the tables. Take care. Bye.